Good? Joke in there somewhere. All good? Okay. All right, we're going to get started. Hello to all of those who have joined us, including those of you on the live stream. It's a little early in the States, so not sure that my mom and dad are tuning in from Michigan or anything, but welcome to any of those that are online, as well as with us in the audience today. My name is Stuart Sarkozy-Bonasi, and I'm the Global Director for Policy and Investments at Resilient Cities Network. And we have a fabulous panel with us today. I want to say thanks to the organizers and all of the people behind the scenes that really made this happen. There's a lot of unsung heroes in all parts of COP, but in each of these panels and these sessions, so really appreciate it. Some quick setup comments, and then I'll get to introductions. Each of the panelists is going to cover a few minutes each on their angle, and as you saw by the title, we're trying to weave together and kind of do some discussion gymnastics on coastal resilience from a variety of angles that bring in codes and policy and banking and frontline and indigenous communities, and the experience of and ongoing work of cities and the mayor. So really want to be able to do that and have questions from the audience, so we'll try to move quickly. The reason that we picked this is that there's been a lot of changes with codes and policy, and there's a lot of money flowing in many different circumstances in the US and elsewhere as we look to get through various pieces of legislation, but also globally. The work that I've been doing with Abed and others brings in similar elements, so we want to be able to share that and start that discussion. So the idea is to take insights from the panelists, city mayor, ESG banker, code builder and promoter, indigenous climate leader, and then consider the practices and then constituents, if you will, of them, of the panelists, and the way that they have to sort of view that work together for community resilience and instigate the conversation. We are using the lens of coastal resilience, but frankly, everything that we talked about could be broken up into other thematics. But the idea here is that the pressures of urban areas, including those that are on the stage, and the frontline indigenous communities, island states, really sort of give us an even closer look at these kinds of things. Some of you will know that Resilient Cities Network is unique in the sense that it's specifically focused on holistic, equitable resilience for urban areas. And then we work with a variety of partners, public, private, and otherwise, to kind of bring that to the fore. And I think a really important thing that is part of my job to set this up is to say that when we say resilience, we don't mean just surviving, and we may not even just mean adapting, we mean thriving. And thriving means a lot more than what we're doing already, especially with the shocks and stresses that we're encountering. And so we want to look at shocks and stresses in combination, and we want to think of this as thriving resilience, not surviving resilience. And of course, these are felt more in these frontline and coastal communities, and where it's already bad and there's stresses, then the shocks come from the kinds of things that we're seeing and the changes that we're seeing. one of the reasons that we want to do this panel as well is that we just did an investment protocol for coastal cities and have a paper out on it, and it includes a lot of input globally, but it was really reflective in the conversation that we're going to have on the stage today. So let me introduce the panelists. I'll just do very short versions of their incredibly long and fascinating bios. No one was worse than the other. Has amazing backgrounds. But of course, just to my right, I have Libby Schaaf, who's the mayor of Oakland and has been so since 2015. And the mayor has overseen a number of institutional changes and the institutionalization, which is amazing, of resilience into the city, into Oakland's government, including adoption of the 2017 Sea Level Rise Roadmap, the Equitable Climate Action Plan, thanks Daniel, and restructuring of the capital improvements program to prioritize resilient buildings and infrastructure. Her passion lies in the betterment of Oakland for generations to come, particularly frontline communities hit worst and first by impacts of climate change. And the mayor is also a member of the Resilient Cities Network Mayoral Task Force, and we're really pleased to have her input and guidance on that. Next to the mayor is Ryan Kolker, who's Vice President of Innovation at International Code Council. Code's the key word there, right, as we continue this conversation. He leads the Energy Resilience and Innovation Center of Focus. He also serves as Executive Director of the Alliance for National and Community Resilience. He previously served as Vice President of the National Institute of Building Sciences and is the editor of the book, Optimizing Community Infrastructure, Resilience in the Face of Shocks and Stresses. You know why he's here. Next to Ryan, we have Abid Kamarali, and he's the Managing Director of ESG Advisory at the Bank of America in London. From 2007 to 2014, he served as Merrill Lynch's, and then B of A, Merrill Lynch, Global Head of Carbon Markets. In 2014, he became part of the team supporting B of A's broader capital deployment commitment, and that's to mobilize 1.5 trillion, it's a T, in sustainable finance by 2030. He has worked for more than 30 years on climate change and sustainable finance and holds an MS in technology and policy from MIT. Bank of America has been an amazing partner to Resilient Cities Network. We're really pleased to have you, Abid. Thanks. And last but not least, all the way at the end, Jade Begay, who is Dene, and Tasuke Pueblo. She's an indigenous rights and climate policy expert, organizer, and filmmaker. Jade has partnered with organizations and tribal nations from the Arctic to the Amazon to develop strategies, create stories, and build campaigns to mobilize engagement and impact around issues like climate change, indigenous self-determination, and environmental justice. Jade is the Climate Justice Campaign Director at Indian Collective, an organization I know well and doing incredible work. In 2021, Jade was appointed by President Biden to serve as in the first ever White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. Jade also sits on the Resilience 21 Coalition Leadership Circle. So really pleased to have you, Jade. So, like I said, we're going to turn to each of them, have 5 minutes each, and then we're going to come to some questions, and then opening questions, and then we're going to come to you. So have your questions ready, and I will turn it over to the mayor.
Great, thank you. So excited to be here. I'm just like fresh on the ground here at COP, so please, hopefully my jet lag won't be talking. I want to talk about 4 things that we are doing in Oakland, just to give you an overview. Obviously, the most obvious power of local government is our building codes, our zoning codes, our land use authority. And so that's the obvious one. Oakland does require all new buildings to meet 100-year sea level rise standards. We've also banned all use of natural gas in all new buildings. There was a bit of resistance to that, and I could talk about some other things that we've done on the local code level, but I want to try and stick to my 4 minutes and to coastal resilience. Another area that we've really leaned in on is the area of community benefits. So for example, we are in negotiations for a major new development on our waterfront. Now, Oakland sits on the San Francisco Bay. Our city actually has 20 miles of coastline, of waterfront in our city. And so We are using major developments to push beyond what the code requires. And this year in particular, we used a very community-driven process to actually develop what the community benefits should look like. And you find different answers than you expect when you actually let your community lead. So for example, one of the top priorities of the Community Benefit Coalition was to actually give some land and to support our first people in Oakland, the Ohlone, with contributions, either fiscal or land, to their land trust. Again, that's probably not something the city government would have thought about as a coastal community benefit, but it was something that was very important to our community. And there are many other parts of the community benefits. What is also exciting is there will be a community benefit fund that the community itself will get to make decisions about over time, not the city government, but the community itself. The third area is community-led action. Please never underestimate the public's power and community organizations and advocates to actually get government to respond to their ideas, their needs. And my favorite example of that was a ballot measure in, I think it was 2016, that was put on all 6 counties around the San Francisco Bay where their land touches the water. And people voted to tax themselves $1 a month, every property owner in all 6 of those counties. It's like probably roughly 6 million people. And that is going to go to restore the wetlands. We have hardscaped the edges of our bay. There is like no adaptation going on. And we're going to actually bring back those nice spongy wetlands to actually help adapt as we see sea level rise. So those are some of the examples of the areas where we see local government and local action taking place. I'm really excited to get questions also about how we put equity first in everything we do. I hope that's a follow-up question. Thanks.
Great. As Stuart mentioned, I'm Ryan Kolker, Vice President of Innovation at the International Code Council, and really appreciate the mayor's leadership and others in California really driving the building code conversation forward and really utilizing those tools to support adaptation and mitigation. I think it's really essential that communities look to their buildings as a key part of their economy, their resilience, their livelihoods, their jobs. And so the Code Council really focuses on the development of model building codes and the support tools that really support their effectiveness. So how do we get those codes in place, and then how do we use them effectively? Codes are really designed to set minimum levels of performance for both resilience and sustainability. And we've seen significant benefits that come along with codes themselves. So in the US, the National Institute of Building Sciences did a study on the role of building codes in providing benefits and found an $11 for every single dollar that a community invests in updating and keeping their building codes updated. I think the sort of key point is, adoption of a code is certainly an enabling mechanism, but without the effective enforcement behind it, training and education, enforcement capacity, we don't really see sort of the impacts that codes could provide. And I think this is particularly relevant where construction is growing. So those are, so that's particularly in the developing world. And so where we design and build buildings today, those are going to be with us for 50, 60, 70 years. And so the decisions that we make today around how those buildings are designed and constructed are really going to impact what we're stuck with for that time frame. I think the other thing that codes really provide a basis or a mechanism for sort of others within the resilience landscape to really have those things that they can latch on to. So whether that's insurance, finance, governments, I'm really understanding that they have the mechanisms in place and the things that they can rely on to assure that community resilience is actually happening. And then sort of taking this another level, Stuart mentioned my work with the Alliance for National and Community Resilience, really building off of what codes to provide to really get to a holistic perspective from community functions that cut across the social, organizational, and infrastructural aspects of communities to assure that we really leverage the things that building codes provide, but really have that holistic approach to the community at large.
Great. So I'm going to give you a financing perspective now. And as Stuart mentioned, Bank of America has this $1.5 trillion capital mobilization target by 2030. And that sort of is, joined at the hip, if you like, with the net zero by 2050 across all scopes. So those are our two North Stars in the climate strategy space. I will say that our activities on resilience are really at a much earlier stage than those on mitigation, and that probably, parallels some of the themes that you've heard at this COP, which is why it's great to have this really good focus, this deep dive on resilience. So the way we're approaching it, there's probably 6 areas I could speak to. One is, how we started out in the space, which is really philanthropic, trying to identify those organizations that have the ability to really shape resilience, and Stuart mentioned that RCN, the Resilient Cities Network, is certainly one of them. We're also working with the Nature Conservancy that's looking at improving coastal resilience in places like Barbados, and there's many others. In the second area would be thought leadership. So one of the organizations that we're part of is the Ocean Risk and Resilience Action Alliance, ORA. And this is doing some really interesting work, trying to identify financing, opportunities, pipelines of investment activities in the ocean risk and resilience space. The third area actually ties back to philanthropy, and it's the CDFI portfolio. So those of you who are outside the US, the CDFIs are the Community Development Financial Intermediary portfolios that US deposit-taking banks have a quasi-regulatory obligation to invest in. And what we've done is by working with RCN, we've helped co-develop a lending tool that can then be incorporated into all of the CDFI portfolio that helps embed resilience into each and every lending activity that those CDFIs undertake. So that's a really good example of, catalytic financing, starting with philanthropy, but then seeing it ripple through to practical loans on the ground across the CDFIs. The fourth area is blended finance. And, at this stage, we don't have an example of where we've invested in a blended finance vehicle that's achieving resilience in coastal regions, but there are certainly examples where Bank of America has come into a vehicle with a focus on resilience, and that's, one example is the Inshore Resilience Debt Fund, which is focused on smallholder agricultural communities, primarily in emerging markets, where the funding goes to procure microinsurance linked to extreme weather events that those smallholders are exposed to. Now, I'm brainstorming live on stage here, but in theory, that microinsurance could be tailored to parametric indices that are linked to sea level rise. I can't see any reason why that wouldn't be the case, but that's perhaps something to explore. The fifth area is bond markets. Now, bonds are very versatile tools, as we've seen, and one of the things that we've done is explore how bond market issuance can be tied to investments in resilience. So in the US market, green municipal bonds, that's something that could be done at the city level, at the state level. We've seen some US states incorporate resilience funding into their use of proceeds for those bonds that have been raised, but not that many, so I think that's got huge potential. The second is a live example, and it's for a country. So Bank of America arranged a $750 million bond for the government of the Philippines. So a sovereign bond issuance that had in its use of proceeds very specific use of proceeds targeted for resilience, including in the water and coastal sectors. As you know, the Philippines is an archipelago of islands. So I think that's a good example that could be applicable to a broader set of countries. And then another example in the bond market is actually something that you've heard about at this COP, which is sovereign debt restructuring. There are some particular NGOs that are looking at this as a very high potential structuring model of structure for countries that are experiencing high debt loads, and essentially it's a debt for nature or debt for climate swap, where the savings achieved in the bond restructuring can then be applied for specific climate or nature purposes. Again, a great example of one product that could be applied to enhance coastal resilience. And actually, I was going to say, because Ryan's comments actually triggered this idea, and that was probably why you had me go after Ryan, right? So one of the innovations that's come into the mainstream bond market is what's called sustainability-linked bonds, where basically corporates issue bonds with ESG parameters, some very specific key performance indicators that are then linked to the coupon of the bond. And there's no reason why in the building sector, in the real estate investment trust sector, resilience KPIs should be linked into those bonds. I've seen it on climate mitigation, energy efficiency improvements, LEED certifications, but why not have it linked to resilience? Okay, I'm getting the eye from Stuart. So the last one, the sixth one, again, one of the themes at this conference is, of course, the potential of the carbon markets. And generally speaking, the carbon markets have been focused on emissions mitigation, but the whole space of blue carbon investments in mangrove restoration, in fact, Libby, you touched on this as well, is an example where if carbon revenue can be derived from those from the sequestration through mangrove restoration, that could be a way to encourage private sector investment. So it's not one that we're currently doing, one that we're monitoring, but I know there are several companies looking at this, and I think that has high potential.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Good to be on this panel with you all, and happy week 2 of COP. It's been a long week. So I'm Jade Begay. I work with NDN Collective. I'm the Climate Justice Campaign Director, as Stuart shared. NDN Collective, as the name points to, is a collective of different arms. And the reason why we're a collective is because we believe that to address the systemic problems in our society, we have to have a systemic approach. So our entire mission is to build Indigenous power, and we do this through our various arms. So we have our nonprofit arm, which is advocacy and philanthropy and grant making, which I have the honor and just joy to share that we are now the largest Indigenous-led fund in the U.S. in history. So yay us. And so that's the advocacy nonprofit arm. We also do movement capacity building, so strengthening our Indigenous movements and climate and environmental justice movements in that arm of our organization. We also have, and we're going to talk about this more on the panel, but our NDN Fund, which is the impact investment and loan arm of NDN Collective. We also have NDN Partners, which is our for-profit arm. So that enables us to partner with Indigenous entrepreneurs, tribes, to build developments, to invest in businesses, and sorry, just thinking through all we do a lot. And yeah, like I said, the mission is to build Indigenous power, to defend our homelands, to develop our nations and our communities, to be adaptive to climate change, to be resilient, but yeah, what you said, Stuart, to get to a place where we're thriving, not just surviving. And we were talking about adaptation here, and I think you mentioned, Mayor, this principle or this value around investing in our communities and trusting them to lead. Our communities are living through these issues, these problems, these challenges of climate change. They're the first. Indigenous peoples across the globe are first hit by all the impacts. We know this, that's why we're here. So we want to take the steps to embolden our communities to lead and really have self-determination around the solutions that are going to help them move through this crisis and be able to thrive. Also, I'll just say that Indigenous peoples have been adapting to crises since contact, since colonizers came onto our lands. So 500 years of adaptation under our belts in our DNA. And NDN is an organization where we are moving resources, creating direct access so that our people can truly lead on climate and adaptation and mitigation and resilience.
Thanks so much. Thanks to all of you. And it starts to conjure up many more questions than we've even talked about, and a great conversation. Actually, Jade's comment about adapting since 1492, one of the reasons I called my company Pre-Covery Labs is that I was at an elders meeting on the reservation where I started a native CDFI, and we were talking about triple bottom line and sustainability, and we were kind of getting into all this kind of newer conversation, and one of the elders that I know really well just turned and said, "Look, we've been in recovery since 1492. It's time for something else." And that's kind of when I was like, okay, how about resilience and pre-recovery? So that's exactly kind of the point. We've got ground to cover from the past, and we have threats from the future. And I think that's where each of the people on the panel and sort of where we are now, there's a lot to come back from the past, and we have to look to the future as well. So, Mayor, I'll come back to you, and you sort of queued it up. We've started to talk about equity more. We really don't in the sense of the common vernacular of resilience, but we've begun to really take that to heart. What role do you see in equity in terms of aligning codes and funding and the policy work as we build resilience, as we build coastal resilience?
Well, I truly believe that when we design systems to actually benefit the people who have been the most disadvantaged by our existing systems, we make things better for everyone. We have started by doing an actual equity index where we have quantified what the disparities are in every major measurement of kind of well-being in our communities. So to have that number and to put this in the context of data as opposed to emotions, I think actually really helps the policy making. And we've integrated data, kind of the equity framework, both through policy making and through processes. So for example, and thank you for reminding me, we actually have done an infrastructure bond program for the first time in Oakland. And it's not easy in California because you have to get a 2/3 vote of the people. 66.7% of the people have to vote to raise their own taxes. That is hard when it's a specific tax like a bond. And so we've been able to do that, but we require equity. So not only do we have a resilience fund within our infrastructure bond program, but a big aspect was just paving the damn roads. If anybody has driven, biked, or walked in Oakland, we've got some epic potholes. And so we didn't want to just pave based on condition. We actually allocated more funds for low-income communities of color, where a flat tire or a twisted ankle has a far more profound impact on that community than in wealthier communities. And so it was a good time to put equity in because everybody was getting more resources, but our equity communities got more resources. The other place is, I love giving the example of our sea level rise roadmap process. So, you know, all you geeky scientists got down, you looked at the data to show like where the water was going to go up, exactly how it was going to flow in the city of Oakland. And then we sat down and showed that to our frontline communities. And what they said was, look, your maps are leaving out a key component. There are so many unhoused people living in our community without sanitation services. There is such a history of toxic pollution in our soil. There's so much trash that blocks the storm drains every time we get an extreme storm that your model is not picking up the actual flooding that we have experienced in our community. And we don't want you only to think about how many inches the water is going to go up. We want you to think about all the toxins that's going to be in the water in our neighborhood that won't be in the water in other parts of the city because of the industrial history that has put extreme toxins into the soil. And so we kind of had to crumple up the, geeky scientist. I know I keep on pointing to you, I'm sorry. The geeky scientist version of our sea level rise roadmap and completely redo it based on the wisdom and experience of our frontline residents and their very legitimate concerns. So I think that is a really cool example of how you actually get to a better product when you listen to the people who have been most affected by our failed public systems.
So, Ryan, in some ways I want you to sort of keep the conversation going with what the mayor just said, but let me add to it, sort of sticking with the technical aspect and the fact that the geeky science sometimes doesn't translate. How do we explain and work with community members, but also government officials at the federal level as lots of money starts to flow? How do we kind of connect the opaque, technical, geeky ways of looking at what becomes something that affects residents, right? Or whoever the residents are, and especially in those hard-hit areas. How do we do some of that translation?
Yeah, and certainly appreciate the question and certainly appreciate the mayor's perspective. I think, codes provide a huge opportunity to advance, resilience and sustainability in communities. But if the community itself is not engaged in that process, doesn't feel like they're heard, it just becomes sort of this technical solution that, it's the government sort of pushing things on them, not recognizing sort of, how that impacts their daily lives. And so I think that's really sort of where that translation is really necessary. I mean, it's on us as code developers, local officials, to be able to identify what are those particular risks, what are the particular solutions, and not from, if you do X, this, Y happens. It's more about sort of that story of, if we think about the storm drainage in the community and implementing a particular solution, this is what it means for your ability to get to work. Or if we look at opportunities in increasing energy efficiency through things like codes, we can lower energy burdens of low and moderate income households who are sometimes paying 3 times the level of their income for energy bills than other households in their community. And so it's really sort of telling those stories, making those connections, and then even identifying opportunities beyond resilience benefits itself. And so being able to sort of identify those co-benefits, I think is really essential.
And sort of sticking with that a little bit, going to Abid, we've talked about the various instruments, and you mentioned a lot of different ways to bring the funding in. But Ryan's also alluding to the fact that this translation that needs to take place, I think of a city like Norfolk, Virginia, where they nearly lost their bond rating and had it lowered until they saw that they had a resilience strategy with a whole series of projects in them that changed the way that the bond rating was going to go, right? The credit rating for the city. And that's a place where they couldn't get to work, to Ryan's comment, in the naval shipyards and the naval base, as well as flooding constantly in the most low-income communities in the social housing areas. So I think when you look at the picture that we're in right now, how do we get more funding in the right places, and how do we bring those sort of practices that you mentioned and make them real and make them scalable? Because we're talking mostly about the United States up here on the panel, but really, our work is in Africa. We're starting these new programs in other places where we've got to be able to reach everybody. So how do we do that? And sort of drawing from sort of a policy, codes, and then the financing. Like, how do we bring that together?
In
and if
3
you can
minutes or
answer
less?
that right now,
Yeah.
we'll just get up and leave.
Yeah. Look, I think there's a couple of things that are going in favor, right? So one is, generally speaking, the theme of ESG, environment, social, and governance investing, is one of the hot themes in the financial market. So that is a good sign that if products are well designed, are meeting proper ESG definitions, so it's not greenwash, they will find a home with different types of investors. So to that point, it's important, that we direct them towards the right types of investments. And so, where I guess I automatically land is probably on this whole topic of taxonomies. We have to make sure that coastal resilience parameters find their way into these sustainable finance taxonomies that are being developed by governments for the most part, because essentially it's becoming a way that whether it's corporates or financials can say, I'm financing this, and that shows up in this taxonomy, therefore that should be counted as green. And that helps investors because they have to do the due diligence and understand if what they're really investing in, is going in the right way, and that's the independent way of providing that assurance. So I would say making sure resilience finds its way into taxonomies. That's the first point. The second is in the area of blended finance, because really your second part of the question was about how do we get scale, and there are many places in the developing world that will find it challenging to go to the bond market. Absolutely understood. And so it's critical then that we lean on development finance institutions, maybe US DFC has a role in that, but it's DFIs and the multilateral development banks who need to be providing the junior capital that will allow, that will basically leverage private capital to come into the more senior tranches of those kinds of blended finance vehicles. And there are really good examples of that. I mean, the world of energy access has become, financing and energy access. So energy access in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, has become easier because more DFIs, more MDBs are recognizing that if they go into the junior tranche, junior debt or junior equity, they will get lots of private capital interested in investing in those. So the same concept applies to coastal resilience.
Thanks. And sticking with a little bit of the finance piece, but sort of taking it down to the community level, Jade, you mentioned the various arms of Indian Collective, and one of them is the Indian Fund. And of course, it's been fascinating to watch that grow and to also be involved. Can you talk a little bit more about how that's working and how the assessment's been being done with the loans and the projects that come in? But also, you've been doing some work in Alaska on the coastlines and with the organization there. So, take us down to that local level and kind of talk about that mix of where the local action meets the funding that Indian Collective and Indian Fund is doing.
Yeah, so Indian Fund, as I mentioned, is our CDFI arm. It's the impact investing and lending arm of NDN. that provides pre-development, bridge, and large-scale financing for indigenous regenerative community and national development projects that scale up investment and shift all decision-making power to indigenous peoples. NDN Fund also provides financing for indigenous small businesses and nonprofits. And really at the core of our work, not just at NDN Fund, but throughout NDN, is that we value relationships. Relationships are sacred to us. And so I'll also mention that when I say Native Indian is Native-led, Indigenous-led, I'm not talking about we have one or two people on leadership, the token Native or the token Indigenous person. Our entire organization is Indigenous. Our entire board is Native and Indigenous. And why I mention that is because this organization is made up of people from the front lines. We inform how we build these things, and we can say that it's our communities on the line. So when we're designing NDN Fund or NDN Partners or any campaign that comes out of NDN, it's informed by our lived experience and the lived experience of our relatives and the communities that we're accountable to. So relationships are sacred to us in this work, and we focus really on that. And then I'll mention just, how do we stay accountable? Accountability is the name of the game, right? When it comes to moving dollars and how those dollars are being used. So we have what's called the Resilience Impact Assessment, which is really a tool for us to make sure that when we partner with a community or a tribe or an organization, that their work is aligning with our mission to defend, develop, decolonize. And also that their work is reaching community, that it's being applied and has direct impact on the community that the project is engaged in. And I'll just say, it's important that these types of accountability mechanisms are in place, because when they're not in place, you have things happen, such as who was at Glasgow last year, COP26. Okay, so you probably heard about the $1.7 billion investment from philanthropy to give funds, resources to indigenous communities. On Monday, a week ago, a report came out saying that 7% in the last year, 7% of those dollars, made it to indigenous communities. That's a failure, full stop. And so when you don't have accountability mechanisms or processes, when you don't have indigenous peoples directing, advising these types of funds and financial mechanisms, they fail. 7% is a failure. So this is why we've built our own internal mechanism, so that we're making sure we're accountable to ourselves, but we're also accountable, and the projects we partner with and give loans to are accountable to their communities.
Thanks. And one of the amazing things about the Resilience Impact Assessment tool that Jay described also is that they sprung ahead from the other CDFIs and impact investors and other organizations that are working on the tool. And we've adapted it for our grant making and the Resilient Community Impact Funds. But Indian Fund and Indian Collective have actually advanced the use of it and how it's done in an indigenized version that is informing loan committee decisions and things like that. So it's amazing to see it kind of having been done at a certain point, everybody working together, Jade and others being on these common committees, and Indian Fund and Indian Collective, like other things they've done, like Land Back, just took it by the reins and went ahead, and that's just been amazing. So I have more questions for them, and we can continue the dialogue, but I want to turn to the audience and see if there's any questions from anyone in the audience. Yes, is there a roving mic? Thanks, Anna. Oh, it is the mic.
Hello, I hope everyone can hear me. This question is directed to Jade. I hope I got your name right. I am Tanin Kuntai from Kenya, and I come from an indigenous community. And thank you so much for what you're doing, especially on the 5 centuries of adaptation. That is so true. We come from an arid land, but I want to understand how best can we invest in harnessing indigenous knowledge, their adaptive capacity, their coping mechanisms. How best can we invest in?
So, I guess my very simplified solution or response is philanthropy, getting out of our way to be able to manage our funds. NDN Collective believes that when indigenous peoples are resourced and when the barriers are removed to have direct access and to make decisions around our resources, we have the power to change not just our communities, but the world. Mary, you talked about how when we resource and create the ability for our communities to lead, frontline communities, disadvantaged communities, whatever you want to call it, to lead, everyone benefits. We believe that when indigenous rights, when indigenous knowledges are upheld and centered in funding mechanisms, in climate finance, in climate policies, domestic and international, everyone thrives. I want to mention 2 examples of NDN funds and NDN's work around how we've protected indigenous knowledge as climate solutions. So we have the Wolakota Buffalo Sanctuary and Buffalo Range that we've invested into. And this is a local regional economic model that is providing or accelerating and advancing climate justice. It's enhancing or protecting and advancing food sovereignty, and it's creating jobs. Everyone's favorite thing about climate, I guess. But yeah, so when you bring back the buffalo, you're not just bringing back a food source and bringing back a very culturally significant relative to the Lakota people. You're revitalizing soil, because when buffaloes I forget the word, when they move through the land, their hides catch seeds, and when they roll around in the dirt, they spread seeds, they literally regenerate soil, and we need that right now. And like I said, having people, tribal members and community members working with the buffalo at all these different scales, doing the sanctuary, running the range, doing meat processing, it's creating a lot of economic benefit for the entire region. So that's indigenous knowledge. And so, yeah, driving resources to those types of solutions that can be scaled and can be replicated in different parts of the world.
I maybe add a perspective from the code side. We often like to talk about sort of the engineered buildings that we see sort of prevalent in cities, but being able to recognize the thousands of years of knowledge in vernacular architecture that's sort of built up in particular communities to address the particular challenges that they face is really essential. And so we've really thought about, those opportunities and that need to work at the local level to really understand, sort of what are the mechanisms within those buildings that really has, provided benefits to communities, and being able to support, the continued use of those and, not sort of hindering that ability, through codes. So I think that's definitely an important point.
So I've got to add that we had a nightmare with our codes. There is this land back movement that I think is so beautiful, but mostly it's been private holders of land that have been giving land back to the indigenous peoples. Oakland just became the first city in California and possibly the country to give city-owned land back to our first people. And so I hope people go back to their governments, to their local cities, to say that this has been done. It was not easy, but the other thing that I thought was very important is we invited our indigenous organization, which is not federally recognized, which made it very complicated in America, but we invited them to look at all the land in our city. We did not tell them which piece we were going to give back to them. We offered them everything, and they chose a piece that was important to them, significant to them. So I just hope, if anyone is interested in following up about our journey of actually giving municipally owned land back to our indigenous people, it is one of the most satisfying things I've been able to do as mayor.
First of all, thank you so much for underscoring that NDN has a land back campaign, and we've really worked to popularize the narrative and visibilize the movement and strengthen it. Again, I mentioned earlier, we're a capacity building movement, capacity building organization, specifically in movements. So that work is super important. But again, just building on the question that you had asked. So on Thursday, President Biden announced a bunch of different commitments that the U.S. is going to do around climate action here at COP27, and what they're launching on the U.S.'s front as far as climate action. And one of those was the People's Finance Access Facility, which would move resources to indigenous communities to support indigenous land stewardship. The issue with this is that the mechanism or the entity that they are moving resources through is a non-native led conservation group, Conservation International. That organization, and I will name names because the stakes are too high, but that organization has a deeply problematic relationship with indigenous communities. And so this is where, and yeah, you can believe me when I say we are on it in our advocacy. We are telling the White House and the State Department that that entity that's moving those resources needs to be indigenous-led. They can work with us. They can work with another native-led financial institution. But you mentioned Nature Conservancy. These organizations, there needs to be interrogation around where and who finances and resources are moving through. It needs to be led by indigenous peoples.
Thanks. And just a quick note, and we'll go back to the audience, but one of the things that was already said is that if you listen to the local community to design what you're doing, you're going to get a better outcome. And that comes with resilience and regeneration and the land back movement. And it goes up layer by layer. So at the global level, the UNFCCC has to listen to its community, right? Just like the mayor said, they had to listen to the community. So it has to happen at the hyper-local level, and it has to come up through every level, whether it's a tribal government, state, province, national government, and to these global convenings, so that when the decision is made to do something and act, especially when we think about major financing, that the community is engaged, that's supposed to be engaged, and the decision is made right. So I think that's almost a thread through this in order to get this right. And I really appreciate the question and where this went as well. Other questions from the audience?
Hi, thank you all for being here. I really appreciate all your time and insights. I think my question is probably for the mayor and also Mr. Kolker. Considering there's been this huge increase in federal funding opportunities as well as initiatives in the last couple of years, mostly in the last year, I'm wondering first what you think some of the greatest barriers to access for some of these funding opportunities or initiatives like the National Initiative to Advance Building Codes, for example, A, what you think the greatest barriers to access are, and B, if you have any advice or best practices for municipalities or regions that are trying to take advantage of some of these federal funding opportunities or initiatives.
Thank you for that question. I want to start by saying, I so appreciate this president, this administration, more than $1 trillion for infrastructure, the IRA. I mean, this is huge stuff. And now I'm going to criticize them. Because you criticize the people you love, right? My hardworking staff, which is trying to actually deliver resilience every day, is pulling all-nighters to write up these competitive grants that are actually pitting us against other cities to compete for these funds, instead of encouraging us to collaborate, encouraging us to approach this as a regional collaborative, and for cities like Oakland that have actually done the work. We have a resilience playbook. We have an equity-led climate action plan. We have an equity-based sea level roadmap. Just give us block grants. Why are you making us compete? We've done the work. Why do we need to fit into your vision of what needs to be done in our community? Because you don't live here. We're on the ground. We're with the people. And so it has been a little frustrating. The amount of resources is awesome, but that tired old process of competitive grants, I just think it is so offensive. I am spending your public money to pay for a lobbyist in Washington, D.C. that is helping me get your public money, just the public money that's at the federal level rather than the city level. What a waste of public resource. I hate that. I have a lobbyist. It's so shameful. So those are some of the things that I think would really improve this. And I know you were going to ask us to do a 1-minute call to action. This is a role philanthropy and advocates could really help with. We are in this moment where we have unprecedented amounts of resources, but the process and the ability to ensure that those resources are going to have the greatest impact, I'm worried that we are not lined up for success to really maximize this moment.
So I'm going to amplify that a little bit from sort of the opposite perspective of Oakland, who has, the resources and the capacity to develop the plans, to apply for the grants. There are many communities, in the U.S. that do not have that capacity. And so being able to assist them in, understanding sort of what are the rules, what are the application processes, how do you even develop the plans to start that, is incredibly challenging for rural and small communities. And so the Code Council is actually working to help support those communities in accessing the $1.2 billion to update their energy codes, which is a huge step forward. So we certainly recognize that challenge. I think the missing piece in IRA is that while the energy codes can help on the climate mitigation side, there was no corresponding investment in climate adaptation. So building code, the International Building Code, International Residential Code, that helps communities address the climate effects that they're already seeing, did not similar level of investment. And so I think that's really a shortcoming as well.
Yeah, and I'm really glad that Ryan took it in that direction, just because I am going to ask each of the panelists to sum up in 1 minute what the most urgent action is as we wrap up the panel.
I did mine.
That was yours? Okay. But I do want to reflect, I mentioned the Resilience 21 Coalition. Ryan's been active on it, and Jade is on the leadership circle, like I said. And part of that pushing on the policy is what's so important, because it's not so much the what now, it's the how. And those unaligned agencies and ministries in lots of countries, including the US, and how the dollars flow is really prohibitive, because then it's much harder to go to the private sector and say, we've got a match, we've got we've got the layer cake already being built, right? So this is really a message for anyone that's in any of these situations, whether it's the United States or otherwise, which is what's been amazing about the Resilience 21 work and doing some of the legislative advocacy on that. And really appreciate these guys doing it. So the setup here as we come to a close, because we've already almost gone the hour, is what is that next step? What is that most urgent thing that weaves this together from your perspective as we leave here?
I mean, from my perspective, certainly advancing the adoption, implementation of building codes as that enabling mechanism for many of the different things that we're trying to achieve. And so, working with communities to help support that process and assure, as the mayor said, that, sort of all aspects of the community are engaged in that process is really essential.
Yeah, and for me, I think it's it's about time that we see financing instruments incorporate resilience metrics and not just mitigation metrics, because there's huge momentum, lots of interest both on the corporate side and on the investor side. So I think that's where we can work together to make sure we're designing the right metrics to get financing flows in the right direction.
Trying to decide which call to action. So many. Well, we talked about land back, popular movement across the world now, but I want to shine light on another movement, which is the ocean back movement, and particularly gaining traction in Alaska. So we've all probably seen the rise and the excitement about kelp growing as a climate solution. So in coastal communities, particularly in Alaska, what we're seeing is kind of these permitting grabs, ocean grabs of, land or, coastal areas where companies, private sector, Elon Musk, are taking all of these permits right now so that they can have carbon sinks, so that they can do offsets and be involved in the carbon market. And this is taking away from coastal communities, indigenous coastal communities, and their inherent rights to those coastal lands. So I'm also on the board of Native Conservancy, which is a partner of NDN Collective. We're helping them scale up their regenerative local model, economic model, helping them build food sovereignty in their communities. And a part of our big fight right now is around this permitting issue. And so we need all the support we can get on that front. And then I'll also just mention another coastal community we work with is in Newtok, Alaska, which is Western Alaska. NDN is coming to the rescue because FEMA has failed to help this community relocate because of permafrost loss. This community was forced to live in this village on the coast of Alaska. They were nomadic. They were a nomadic indigenous community in Alaska. And when Alaska was settled, the U.S. government forced this community to settle and be stationary. And now climate change is at their doorstep, literally washing away their community, their buildings, and no one's coming to the rescue. So not only did they, again, be forced to live in this place, not only did they not contribute at all to the climate crisis, no one's helping them. The government is not helping them. And so we're proud to work with Patagonia to support this relocation effort. But we need financial investment. We need help on the building front because we're talking about rebuilding an entire community. So that's just, and I'll just say that it's not getting media attention. So I just want to drive attention there. And however we can partner, it's all about relationships. So yeah, let's work together and support this community so that they can find a home.
Perfect timing. It died right as trying to wrap up. So, indigenous-led financial instruments, codes, policy, and funding guidelines there are solutions, and they have to be in combination, and that's why we came together, and that's the message that we send out. And I hope that this just starts more of the discussion, and that you can speak with the panelists and take this further. So really want to thank all of you. This is fantastic. We could have used much more time, as we knew, even coming into this. Appreciate all your insights and your angles on this, and thank you to the audience too.